is Laurie. I am here to talk about death doulas, what we do, and what sort of need it's in response to. This is a long bio, but I'll just highlight some stuff. I am a licensed clinical social worker, grief therapist, and death doula. I also do a lot of grief and death education because there's just such a need, right? Before we can be full-time working death doulas, people need to know that death doulas exist, that there is such a service, that there is maybe even a need in their life that they weren't fully aware of. I came to this work pretty honestly in that I just like to talk about things other people tell me I shouldn't talk about. So whenever I was hushed, I was like, why? What's that about? And that curiosity really led me here. I think mostly a career should try to blend, if we can, a need, an interest, and a capacity. And that's sort of where mine led me. I do work with medical aid and dying families in New Jersey. I find that incredibly just wonderful and rewarding work. I also focus on LGBTQIA folks as a person who's a member of that community myself. I also really love working with skeptics as a skeptic as well. I live in West Philly. I have a cat and a dog, and I welcome you to ask questions, to interject. Like, this is a conversation, right? Like, I can't see y'all when the screen is shared. So please feel free to say, hey, and y'all, if you'll help me notice when someone is interested in a question or when one pops in, that would be wonderful. But until then, I'll just chat. And as questions arise, please do feel free to ask them, although I will leave space at the end too. So
And
that's,
Laurie, just to let you know, I'll be monitoring the chat for you if anything comes up.
thank you. Yes. Yeah. And interject just like that. I promise I will not be in the least bit offended whatsoever. So this is our general plan for today. I always include a teeny bit of Grief 101 just because there's so much information, and I know how grief tinged these conversations can be. So I feel like that really helps set the container for the rest of the learning. Then I'll talk about death doulas in general, a brief history, the Anelda model, which is one of the predominant models, but is not the only model. It's the one I happened to be trained in. Questions that death doulas ask, which is kind of like a social media thing that I do, but I also think is a really good indicator of what kind of makes a death doula a little bit different than other death workers. And I'll try to answer some frequently asked questions at that point. But of course, if you have extra or different questions or want to know more about something, I welcome it. And then I like to end with death positivity and possibly a little bit of an example of the work a death doula might do. So death positivity is, again, part of the container that I use for these conversations. And I think it can be really useful for going forward. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in that, but it's, again, an intro of sorts. And if you're interested in it, I do provide some resources at the end, so you can go a little deeper if that's something you'd like to do. And then vigil planning, which is something a death doula might do with a client, but is not at all something you only have to do at the end of your life. It's something you can give thought to at any point. And I'll invite you to do that today, to your own capacity. So why do I talk about grief every time? Because so much of what we know or we think we know about grief is coming from outdated research that can be actually harmful when applied too broadly or when it's projected onto other people. Cool thing about theory is they're just theories, right? You do not have to ascribe to any of these things if it differs from your own lived experience. Take what works for you, leave what doesn't, and just kind of use it to inform the way that you engage with your own grief and the grief of others in the world around you. One of my favorite folks who writes about grief is Francis Weller. He wrote The Wild Edge of Sorrow, among other works. And I think that this perspective of grief and love being sisters or siblings, they come together and they are universal experiences. we can't avoid either. And so it could be helpful to all of us to try to talk about at least the one we prefer not to talk about. So there are a lot of common grief myths out there, right? And you probably have your own, that when you had a big grief for the first time, you were like, oh my gosh, I thought fill in the blank, right? Things that movies teach us, things that platitudes teach us, right? Things that people say without really thinking, or they say to soothe themselves instead of to soothe the griever. So among them, again, I'm not going to read all these to you, but there's this really pervasive belief that grief is a lot like another illness, like a common cold. You just get a little bit better every day until one day, poof, grief is gone. And anybody who has grieved before can tell you that's not really what it's like. Healing is not linear. Grief is not linear. And there is no set end point. When grief ends, well, I don't know that it does, but there is no return to what there was before. There is a new life, hopefully one where grief is integrated, right? And is no longer the acute pain that it can be. But it's not that we ever quite go back to the way things were before. Another really pervasive one is the 5 stages, right? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and later David Kessler, that original research was done with people who were dying, not people who were grieving. Well, they were grieving their own deaths, right? But you can imagine how that might be a very different lived experience than someone who is grieving the loss of a person. And they were never developed to be linear or prescriptive. Elizabeth never said, this is it. This is all the things you feel in grief. And if you feel things outside that, you're weird. But that's how many of us took it. I still get grievers to come in my office and say, well, I was in this stage, but now I'm in this. And no, it's okay if that helps you, right? Like if you resonate with that theory, please use it. But when we get stuck around these ideas of a way we're supposed to be grieving, it can be really harmful. Another really big one is that you can grieve many different types of losses. And they don't only have to be sad experiences, right? I don't know if you've ever moved houses. Maybe moving was a really good thing. Maybe you moved into a bigger, fancier, beautiful place, the place you always dreamed of. But you can still grieve for the place that you were leaving, for the experiences you had there, for the coziness, for its quirks, for the growth that you experienced there. So we don't only grieve deaths. I already spoke a little on this, that grief has no linear stages. But okay, so if we're not using the 5 stages of grief exclusively, right, prescriptively, what do we use? So I'll talk really briefly about a couple of theories. One is the dual process model. And this one is very helpful in explaining the sometimes sudden oscillation that grievers feel. You know, if you've ever been walking in the grocery store and you see something that your person used to buy or prepare, and suddenly you're crying in the grocery store and you're like, but I was fine 5 minutes ago. That's the oscillation that this model tries to encompass, that it's a dynamic process, that you are supposed to move back and forth between really more than 2, but these 2 spaces of loss-oriented and restoration-oriented coping. And this normalizes that people who look okay are still grieving, right? Like sometimes moving on, getting things done in your life is part of grieving. It's all a part of grieving. It's not just crying. It's not just outwardly mourning. That is important in the grief process. In fact, you need both. So then we move towards grief companioning, which is really more of a way to accompany grief or support grief than it is a prescriptive theory of grieving. You also notice none of these theories are prescriptive. They allow for the individuality of humanity, which I think they should. So the tenets of grief companioning include being present and not fixing, right? So many of the platitudes that I alluded to come from a place of like, well, you'll be okay. And right under that is the subtext, you have to be okay. This expectation that you will someday return to normal because your grief is making me uncomfortable. So, how do we just be present with things? How do we just be present with the grief, knowing that grief itself is normal, a totally normal response to loss? Listening with the heart instead of analyzing with the mind. This one's hard. Bearing witness, walking alongside, not leading or being led. One of my favorite grief gurus, if you will, Dr. Bob Niemeyer, he often says to us in trainings, lead from one step behind. So even as a therapist, where we are in community to specifically work on some tasks, some things that we're working towards together, leading from one step behind and allowing that griever's grief to be the guide. And then my favorite, continued bonds. At one point, it was considered maladaptive and problematic for grievers to hold on too much, to remain in connection with their person, to talk out loud to them. That was all considered wrong, and it was stigmatized behaviors. And that's a problem culturally, because in some cultures that's completely normal and actually really important, but it's also a problem personally in the micro level, because it's actually it's kind of good for us. So when people feel that urge, right, it's not prescriptive, so you don't have to do this, but we're supposed to, this idea that we're supposed to detach or accept and have this whole new life, again, the moving on language, it's really, really hard for some grievers. In fact, many of them outright hate it. You can find lots of grievers on the internet being like, don't tell me to move on. We move with, right? And this is one way we can move with. So this theory says that these are not pathological behaviors, that grief is ongoing and lifelong, that it's normal to stay in contact with our dead loved ones, and it helps normalize and describe grief-related behaviors. And I can tell you just personally and anecdotally that when I explain this theory to grievers, they're often like, oh, thank goodness. It gives you permission. Your relationship will not be the same, but you are still in relationship with your person. So I'll pause there for one moment, because these are the theories that we kind of use to inform the practices that death doulas use in their practice. And the idea being that this is a more holistic approach, that the medical world does a really great job in some places and a not so great job in other places, particularly when it comes to really stigmatized or challenging areas of practice. So I freaking love palliative care and I love hospice care. Those folks are not who I'm talking about. It's everyone up until then. Although hospice and palliative care aren't perfect either, and neither are death doulas. But just this idea that we can talk about this long before the hospice referral comes. And in fact, the hospice referral usually comes way, way, way too late. Last I checked on this, the average amount of time spent on hospice was something like 7 days. Somebody knew that their prognosis was 6 months long before that, but it wasn't communicated in a way that the family or the individual making the decision felt comfortable. So that's one place where death doulas can enter. So what we're looking at here is an over-reliance on a medical model, not the elimination thereof. We obviously need modern medicine, and I'm very grateful for it personally, but an over-reliance on any one model leaves some people out. So what the heck is a death doula, right? We are a non-medical support person for dying individuals and their family, however they define that. And truly, this can happen anywhere in the lifespan. We are, there's a lot of language stuff around this because the word doula comes from Greek. It means female helper. Not every death doula identifies as female. There's also lately been a conversation about how that word really actually means slave. And so that obviously has some reactions there. So this is fluid, but we're death companions, death midwives, death helpers, death workers. All of those language kind of speak to this same practice. And we're trained to provide advice, information, emotional support, physical comfort to a person or a family. We are not a replacement for hospice. In fact, I often really strongly would like to practice alongside hospice, but every death doula kind of has their own approach to that. We are inherently non-medical. I am not a nurse. Some death doulas are nurses, and their practice is different in the ways that their licenses prescribe it. Some death doulas are massage therapists, Reiki practitioners. I'm a social worker, and thus that sort of colors the way that I approach death doula practice and the types of support that I'm qualified to provide. But everyone has their own unique areas of training and practice that can make for a really good fit, right? For each family and each individual. And maybe my favorite part, which is down here at the bottom and maybe shouldn't be, is that we exist in a liminal space, a space in between, a space of transition and mystery, magic even, and sacredness. And this is something that is really important that is happening. And sometimes that gets lost in the logistics and the response to what feels like emergency and urgency. And death does not have to be an emergency if we are offered the chance to plan, which not everyone is given, right? But sometimes we are and we miss it. And so a death doula can enter in that space and help hold it. This is a super brief history, but it's sort of how I imagine it. Before the Civil War, all communities and maybe even all families had people who served in this way. Some were birth and death, which is a tradition that continues to today. Some just showed up when things were getting rough. And they weren't medical doctors per se. And also the practice of medicine was quite different at that time. So just showing up and being present was sometimes all that they knew to do, and was a bigger gift than perhaps we knew how to quantify. Civil War rolls around, and I don't know how much you know about death care, but everything changed then. People were dying really far away from their families, and some of those families understandably wanted to figure out how to get their people back. And this is really when the practice of embalming became much more common and professionalized, at first out of necessity. In particular, President Lincoln, he went all over. And the only way that was possible was through embalming. So time passes, right? And this practice is becoming more and more common, some cultures more than others, right? And it became professionalized in the sense that men started doing it and selling it. So at this time, most women weren't working outside of the home, but prior to that, this was not a gendered practice. Right? Death care was not a gendered practice until it became professionalized. In the late 1960s, the birth doula movement began kind of in reaction to the same thing, the over-medicalization of the birthing process. And the birth doula model became formalized. About 20 years after that, the NYU Medical Center volunteer program paired doulas with terminally ill people. They recognized a need and they were like, oh dang, we need more support. Some people are dying alone. This also happened a lot during the AIDS crisis. People who knew there was nothing to be done, but felt strongly that someone should be present. Someone should care about the comfort of these individuals. This was all kind of happening together. Again, brief history. But around 2000 is when people started developing formal trainings, Baylor among them as well. So they had a 6-week training. In continuum hospice in New York started with the Anelda model. Henry Furco Weiss, who was the founder of Anelda, was at that hospice, and he was a social worker. In 2015, the actual organization of Anelda was founded, adapted the model formally, started training and professionalizing outside of a single hospice. And that is where I received my training. In 2017, the National End of Life Doula Alliance was founded, and their aim was to be this outside organization that would have standards that they don't train people. So it was this outside organization. They're like, okay, well, Anelda meets our standards. Sacred Passing meets our standards. This place meets our standards. Here are our standards, right? An outside organization that doesn't profit from the training itself. In 2018, death doulas were given a special counsel within the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. Again, this blending. Oh, you guys are doing something super supportive to what we do, and you're answering a need that many of us notice. How do we do this together? And a lot has happened since then, to be honest. I just, it's very difficult to distill. A lot has happened since then. Since 2018, which also happens to be the year that I was trained, this movement has taken off, mostly on the edges, the edges of the country, many big cities, as you might imagine, but also some of the crunchier places. And another meaning like hippies, people who are really emerged, like really interested in holistic care. But on top of that, a place that I didn't necessarily expect to see it, but that I have, is in rural communities, because hospices are overtaxed and they want to meet all the needs, but they cannot. Post-pandemic, the need for home health aides is astronomical. Now, a death doula is not a home health aide. They're not a replacement for that, but they can certainly help with some of those needs and also help advocate for those needs to be met. So people started dying differently. For instance, dementia. I guess we don't have great data about the incidences of dementia because we didn't understand it in the same ways, but these are longer deaths. They're slower deaths. They're different deaths. And so areas of expertise have emerged to help families meet their needs and to understand what is happening. They're also stigmatized deaths, right? I know before I started working in medicine as a social worker, I did not understand anything about the fact that Alzheimer's is a terminal disease. I just thought, your brain stops working. No, it's a terminal disease that has a trajectory. And again, everyone's different, but it has a trajectory that most people have no idea about. So a death doula can come in to help, not to teach necessarily, like we all have our own areas of expertise, but to say, well, have you asked what the trajectory of this disease usually looks like? Have you asked about prognosis? What resources can your experts provide? A lot of people also started wanting to die at home. Most people want to die at home. And instead, again, new data is coming out of this all the time, but 70 to 80% of people die in acute care settings. What? That's a clear mismatch of what people want and what they get. And I really want to bring those things together, right? I get that there will always be traumatic deaths and deaths that for whatever reason or another end up not going to plan A. Okay, what's plan B? How can we make this as close to what you wanted? And these pieces of meaning and legacy and sacredness, I'm sure there are wonderful people bringing that into some acute care facilities, but not enough, not many. And so that's a place where we can help. So this is the Anelda model. You're like, what do those people do? You're just talking about all these really nice things, right? But what does that mean? And the Unveiled model separates this into three the doula remains in the family's life about 3 to 6 weeks after a death. And we can join at any time, right? I have folks who have kind of reached out to us upon receipt of a terminal diagnosis. Even they may have 2 years, but they want to get started thinking about this stuff. They will feel better if they have a relationship that they know they can rely on later. Perfect. I get calls very late. Totally okay as well. It can be better if we have more time, but it's not required. So in the beginning, we address worries, we address issues, questions like I just said, what is your prognosis? I cannot tell you how many times people have no idea what their prognosis is. That seems like important information to me. Now, the person gets to decide whether they want to know, of course. But many of them do want to know and don't know how to ask. So we work through that. At this time, we might start legacy projects. And that could be, people think, oh, legacy, what does that mean? I'm not rich. I don't have a scholarship. That can be one form of legacy. But I mean a recipe book. I mean a pillow made from your shirts. I mean tagging your jewelry so the right people get the right things. I mean making a video to children who are going to grow up. That's what I mean by legacy project. It can be so simple. Letters to open on birthdays. It's really endless. And you've probably heard really amazing and touching stories about ideas for legacy projects, but they are as unique as the individual completing them. And so we can help with that. We can help identify the right project for the person and get to the place where they might feel ready to do that project. We inform about the dying process. What will it look like? What will it be like? And now I can't tell you how it feels because I've never done it. But I can tell you what it looks like generally, and what we can do to support you at each stage. And then we design rituals. If again, we don't get a plan B, a plan A, what's our plan B? And rituals, again, is another one of those big words that people can get a little scared about. My morning coffee is a ritual. It is as important to me as any of the religious or spiritual rituals I have been engaged in my life. So it can be that simple, and we're going to talk about it until it comes into a way that makes sense for that person. Conducting vigil, which we're going to talk a little bit about more later, if we get there, hopefully we do. Yeah, we'd have time. And how we're going to support you, in that time. After the death, we have usually a meeting or two where we assess for additional grief support, whether it's needed. I, again, am a grief therapist, so I may make a referral, or maybe in some cases that person would like to work with me in a therapy environment. That may or may not be appropriate, but we'll assess, we'll talk it out, and we'll get you connected to whatever kinds of supports you need. The doula can also offer, okay, it's really hard to remember all this stuff. Like, there is a grief fog that comes over, and I encourage people to journal, but like sometimes it's just not possible. It's just not possible. And so I can offer stories. Oh, there was this moment when X happened. And those stories can become really important, and hopefully just little, if they're not important, just little tidbits to create the story of what happened. And then we close. So through all of this is something I hold with me as much as possible in my practice, is that there is no caregiving tool more valuable than just listening. And we really skip over that one on every level. Sometimes even our closest loved ones have a lot of trouble slowing down and listening. And there are often really good reasons for that, right? But a doula cares deeply, but is not a member of this family or this family group. It's a little bit easier for us to do that. And hopefully, between listening to the dying individual, listening to their loved ones, people's needs can get met a little bit better than if we were not there. This piece about asking questions, right? I find that people in medicine don't love open-ended questions. On a scale of this, tell me your pain. I might ask, what sensations are you experiencing in your body right now? They're both kind of assessing for the same thing, right? For different practices, but I'm not as goal oriented when I ask questions. And sometimes this is confusing for people because I'm so exploratory, we're so open ended, but we are going somewhere and we'll get there. I just don't know where we're going yet. We've got to get there together. Sometimes we have a goal. I can be goal oriented too, especially if I'm given that information as the need that needs to be addressed today. But we also ask these questions that no one else thinks to ask, or maybe they do, but they don't have time. I know a lot of hospice social workers who would love to ask questions like this, but they have a caseload of 50. We can help prevent a couple of less desirable outcomes. We can help prevent last minute hospitalizations. Sometimes people feel very strongly about a loved one's last breaths. And if they don't know what to look for, they don't know when to be there or when to take a break or when not to take a break. And we can fill in the gaps. I know I mentioned this already, but we're into the FAQs section now. We work alongside hospice. We are supplementary and complementary support. If you have ever worked with hospice, you know they're freaking amazing, but we often have this image of like, well, someone will be there with me 24 hours. And that is not what hospice does. Some people will get 1 hour a week with their social worker, max. Some people will get one visit. So how do we meet in the middle? How do we make sure people's needs are met and last minute questions can be met? And yes, hospice almost always has a 24-hour hotline, but it's not always enough. And that's okay, right? It's less a judgment of hospice than it is a recognizing of a need. When do you call a doula? Anytime you want. Anytime you want. During the pandemic, I have been doing a lot of advanced care directives with people of all ages, 18 and up. Some of these people have chronic illnesses that they were like, oh, if I get COVID, stuff could get real. Like I was well managed without COVID in the world, but now I'm worried. Some of them were just like, I just had a kid. Didn't occur to me. And COVID made them kind of think about it. So anytime. Great question, right? How much does this cost? Who pays for it? So some organizations, as I mentioned, some hospices have doulas under their auspices, in which case it would be covered. But this is pretty rare in my experience, pretty rare. So many organizations that offer doula services, including my own, offer sliding scale pricing. Our sliding scale starts at $0. And it's self-identified, right? We ask our clients, look at this scale. There's kind of a guide about their financial world, and then they tell us how much they can afford to pay. Sometimes we do this hourly. Sometimes we'll say, okay, for this many hours a week, we're just going to have a contract, and we'll draw up a contract and work it out. It just depends on the person. And again, this is being willing to talk about things that other people don't like to talk about. Talking about money is hard, but it's important too, to make sure that people's expectations are aligned. So Average cost, again, this is based on my practice and my knowledge of other people's, which is not perfect. It's not all encompassing. Our scale is like 0 to 175. I've heard folks take clients for like 3 to 5K as like an all-encompassing thing. But again, this just depends on the person. It is not currently billable through insurance. It may be at some point. I'm sure someone is working really hard on that policy right now. And I do ultimately think that this will be a covered service because I do think it will save insurance companies money. Those like outcomes that I mentioned before, last minute and futile hospitalizations cost so much money. And so I think that maybe someday that will be a thing, but I also know that that comes with its own trade-offs, right? Where do we practice? Anywhere we're welcome. So I have, before the pandemic, been in long-term care facilities, certainly in private homes, now practicing virtually in many places. That, of course, that doesn't allow you to sit vigil, but it does allow you to do a lot of education and support. It's really interesting to see how COVID has kind of changed practice and expanded it and made it more accessible in some ways. I do miss being in person. I do miss that. Lots of doulas do work with medical aid in dying in the states where it is currently legalized. I'm in Philly, New Jersey is right there. And it is legal in Jersey since 2018, although really only starting to be done more commonly since 2020. Who certifies doulas? What kind of training do we get? There is no one governing body. I know I mentioned NIDA, but that's not, you don't have to ascribe to NIDA's ethics or values. Like you're allowed to just hang up your shingle and say, I am a death doula today. So there are many, many trainings. I suspect there will be many more. And they cost anywhere from like $750 to, I mean, as much as you probably can imagine. And some of them do offer certifications, but they're not, there's no governing body. So some people do that because they really want to have that experience of being supported through their learning process. And some people don't. Some people learned this in their own lives, you know, from caring for their loved ones. And so do you need a certification for that? I don't know. I'm glad I'm not in charge. I don't want to be in charge. But one of the cool things that this allows is for that specialization. Some are more natural burial focused. Some are seated in certain spiritual practices. In my training, there were quite a few chaplains, ministers, etc., who planned to offer this to the folks that they served in their community, which I think is really, really cool. Because they're certainly going to take their beliefs and their practices of their specific sect of humans, for lack of a nicer word there, and make it work for them, which is what I would love to see, is community-based practices. So given all that, then like, how do you find a death doula? And this is my general advice on that point. Make sure that their stated values and ethics align with those of the client, right? Our values are on our website and we worked real hard on them so that people could see, oh yeah, this aligns with me. This aligns with me. Yep. And if there aren't values and ethics, that's a red flag in my book. Identify a couple of key needs and wants and then tailor the search to those. So if your person is really struggling to get to find resources, right? You might want a social worker or death doula because there's not many people better at finding resources. But you would want to make sure that person is really good at connecting to resources, right? If the vigil is super important, if after death practices are super important, find someone who has a lot of experience in those. But you only need a couple and let those guide you. Ask for references, baby. You should be able to have at least one reference. baseline. And if not, the doula should say, I don't have any references because I'm brand new. And then you get to decide whether that fits, right? Maybe it does. I've had people take a chance on me, but that should be discussed. Anelda.org and NIDA Alliance both have listings on their websites as well. And those are people who say, I agree to these values and ethics that NIDA and Anelda have set forth, right? So they're ascribing to those ethics. And then you would have a recourse. If you had a poor experience, you could write to NIDA or Anelda and say, hey, here's what happened with this person. Now, there's no formal complaint process because, again, there is no one body, but it certainly adds another layer of credibility. All right, let me see where I'm at time-wise. All right, I got 15 minutes. So why does death positivity matter, and what the heck is it? Death positivity, you can imagine this mapped over that previous timeline that I spoke of, right? That there's just this idea about returning to a more holistic model. Caitlin Doty down here in the corner. Yes, this is a tweet. This term was invented on Twitter. There was a body positivity and still is a body positivity movement occurring. And she was like, why is this not happening with body positivity and sex positivity, but not with death positivity, right? These very stigmatized conversations that are really hard for people to have. Why are we ignoring the one that's completely universal? And this all came out of all these other spaces. The emergence of hospice care in the US, the emergence of the natural death movement, advanced care directives being created, palliative care movement in the 80s to today, the green burial movement, which is ongoing as well. The death cafe model, which I don't know if any of you have ever attended a death cafe, but if you like this, you probably like a death cafe. And then behind that, the death doulas emerging, Caitlin herself starting the Order of the Good Death and coining this term. All of this ties back to the work of this dude, Ernest Becker. He wrote about the denial of death, which is that human civilization, his idea that human civilization is an elaborate symbolic defense against the knowledge of our own mortality. Like, sit with that for just 1 second. Everything we do, this thing I'm doing right now, is because at my core, I know I'm going to die and I'm terrified of that. Ooh, resonates with me, but you decide for yourself. This all grew into many other things. You know, his theory is very rich. He wrote a whole book. If it interests you, you can certainly head there as well. But just this idea that our motivation, if we go down deep enough, if we're honest enough with ourselves, is this need to control our anxiety, our death anxiety. Very interesting intellectual argument there. But the tenets of death positivity are, I think, relatively easy to practice in our life. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I'll highlight a couple as we go through, right? I believe that by hiding death and dying behind closed doors, we do more harm than good to our society. I think we harm grievers, and I think we harm the dying too. It's my own addition at the end. I believe that the dead body is not dangerous, and that everyone should be empowered, should they wish to be involved in the care for their own dead. And I know from working with grievers that this can be a really powerful and healing experience. There are some few times when the dead body is dangerous, but that's not what we're talking about. I believe that my family and friends should know my end of life wishes, and that I should have the necessary paperwork to back up those wishes. Seems so simple, right? But it can be really hard and really challenging because many of us don't know where to start. And then I guess.
Did you mean to call me?
What's that? Oh, somebody's.
Okay.
Somebody's not muted. So why does this matter? I already alluded to this a little bit, but death and grief are universal experiences. Every single one of us is going to experience these things at some point. And death avoidance is thought to have a host of negative outcomes, right? Lack of advanced care directives, which reduces self-determination and leads to an immense amount of pain and suffering on the part of those who are left to make a decision without any guidance. Futile interventions at the end of life that can be extremely painful, right? Extension of life versus quality of life. And again, that is not my choice to make, but it should be a choice, right? It should not just be what we do rote without examination. Ineffective pain management. This is a hard one. It's so hard to see our people in pain, but we're also so scared to advocate for them, many of us, and we don't know how. Therapeutic rupture. This happens so much with medical providers who their own death avoidance, their own death anxiety makes it hard for them to have these conversations with their patients, and their patients suffer as a result of it. I've seen physicians and nurses do this amazingly, and I've seen people cause really deep harm because of their own stuff. Truncated and complicated grief, right? I talked a little bit about how these things cause complications for grievers. And then burnout, baby. Oh my goodness. This was happening before the pandemic, but when healthcare professionals don't have the training and support they need to have these conversations, the harm that causes is just immense, right? Because they are there because they want to help. They are helpers, and we don't give them the tools that they need to be able to walk alongside it when the only help that is needed is presence. We don't give them those tools. Some of them have them naturally, some of them learn them the hard way, but what about the others? All right, so vigil planning, baby. This is one of the things that death doulas can facilitate. But I also think it's food for thought for anybody at any stage of life. So we think of this plan as a good or a best under these circumstances death. It can be very detailed, it can be more loose. And it should reflect the character of the dying person, the dynamics of their family, the culture, their traditions. And it should be actionable for the circumstances, right? Like if I say, I want to die on a cloud 500 feet above the earth, cool. I don't know how to do that. How do we make your room as cloud-like as possible? And these are the literal conversations that I have, right? They can start with something outrageous and become actionable. Things to consider here. The space. We talked about again where, but what should the bed be facing? Placement of special objects, how the space looks, highlight, low light. Should be bright and clear. Should there be, scarves and lots of things, creating texture on the walls? Are there posters or pictures you want to see? The atmosphere, smells, sounds, light's kind of both in it. Incorporation of nature. Do the windows and the blinds need to be open? Sometimes a day they need to be open. Do the windows themselves need to be open? Does the breeze need to be part of this? And again, we are thinking of this in context. So if you are dying in a hospice environment, we are not going to have candles, but we can have LED candles, right? How do we make the important things actionable? And sometimes mourn the things that we can't have. That's part of it too. What do you want the tone and tenor of the space to be? Should people be talking? Should it be quiet? Should people pray? Should people sing? Should we be reading from certain books? What rituals did we set forth ahead of time that we should be performing now? And any other ongoing legacy work. Maybe that's part of it, maybe it's not. And there's other pieces too, right? Do you want physical care from your family, or should we mostly allow professionals to do that? Should certain members of family be present or not present? Who should be present if we can for the last breaths? Should we wash your body after you die? It's a very simple way that loved ones can participate is washing the hands and feet and face. You know, it's quite chaste and modest for folks who want to preserve that. And I've found that many family members do feel comfortable washing those parts of someone's body, and it is incredibly beautiful. And then who do we call? When do we call them? I talked a little bit about ritual, but it's important to know that ritual is evidence-based practice. There is study after study showing how important and healing and supportive that ritual can be, because it gives us, false or not, a sense of control, right? We can control the ritual, even if we cannot control what is happening with our loved one and their body or what happens next. So these can be all kinds of things: blessings, objects, washing, as I mentioned, touching, kissing, honoring this mystery and majesty, gathering, just gathering, humming, singing, food and drink. What parts of this are right? I had a client who, a medical aid and dying client, who took his medications, the medications that would end his life, with a $3,000 bottle of wine, because wine was incredibly important to him. And that's how he wanted to go out. Awesome. He told me it didn't taste good. But again, I'm laughing, right? Not because it's funny, but because it's poignant and beautiful and heartbreaking and powerful. That's what we're looking for. These are some questions to ask yourself as you start thinking about your ritual plan. I love talking about music and sound. Should it be quiet? Should there be a rotation of favorite songs? Do we need to make a playlist together? Love to make a playlist. Your loved ones, should they make a playlist? Who should be there? Who shouldn't be there? How do we maintain and introduce sacredness? Or maybe we don't. Maybe we just chill. It's all welcome, right? There's no right or wrong way to do this. And people do scoff at these questions sometimes, and that's okay, right? It tells me where you are at with it. But normally when we sit with it for a second or two, people have ideas, people have thoughts. Okay, this is Alua. We don't have time to watch this whole thing, but I'll send this to you and you should watch her. She is a death doula who also does a lot of training. She's amazing. She's also a lawyer. Here are a bunch of resources. Again, I'm going to send this to you guys so you can, I'll send it as a PDF so that people can watch and click. And that's it.